Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Viana, and first and foremost, I would like to thank you all for sparing some of your free time to be here watching my final presentation. I am a graduate student from a LAC department in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the primary reason for choosing this topic is not only because historically this group has been suffering from discrimination outside and inside the community, but also because they're victims of extreme violence in Brazil that quite often ends up with murder. Therefore, I found relevant to document this current social issue of a segment that is commonly ignored by the majority of the society. Here's my introduction, just a brief overview about the main topics that I will discuss throughout this presentation. Let's get to it. Historical fights, 70s and 80s. Interestingly, the first meetings organized by the community emerged in the mid-1970s during the military dictatorship. Coincidentally, at the same time as the feminist movements emerged in the country. Despite both having a progressive footprint, there was a distance between them. Feminists feared being associated with lesbians because it could compromise the reliability of their movement. The same phenomenon happened with the male gay people and the labor movements that also emerged at the time. Here I also highlighted the first publications for the LGBTQIA plus community. Lampião da Esquina, directed at the male gay community in 1978, and Chana com Chana a few years later, dedicated to the lesbian community. And right there we can see that it was already a little separatism within the community. All of that progressive and allegedly social inclusion movement suffered a significant setback with the advent of the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s. Labeled as gay cancer, it caused a social commotion, and as a result, it generated a new wave of prejudice against the community, especially towards gay men and transvestites. That denomination sounds a little dated, but at the time was broadly used to generalize, to include all the different gender orientations regarding the gay community. And the etymology of the word I will discuss a little further in this presentation. Here I present a chronological history of the first non-governmental organizations in Brazil created to support the LGBTQIA+ community. In 1975, Somos is considered the first attempt to create one of those organizations in Brazil, emerging along with the first LGBTQIA+ movements. But only in 1980, the Bahia Gay Group was created, and until nowadays, it's considered the oldest non-governmental organization for the LGBTQIA+ communities in Brazil. It's still active, and it's still the most famous one as well. In 1983, the first lesbian non-governmental organization in Brazil emerged, the Lesbian Feminist Affirmation Group. Curiously, it's relevant to emphasize that even after they suffer discrimination among feminists, the lesbian group reinforced its political position regardless of the difference between them and kept the feminist terminology into their name. And then only in 1992, the first transgender non-governmental organization group emerged in Brazil. It's relevant to notice that it took almost 2 decades for the transgender community to manage to get together and to organize into a group to try to protect their human rights. And in 2000, the same group, they just changed their acronym to UNTRA. That was an attempt to adopt the term transgender and brings it to a more current gender coverage. But until nowadays, UNTRA remains the most influential organization in Brazil. The paradox between legal accomplishments and the rise of violence. Despite the country having a set of legal protections considered progressive by Latin American standards, such as the criminalization of homophobia, legalization of marriage, an official right to adjust gender and name in legal documents, impunity prevails. The transgender community suffers through intimidation, death threats, and physical violence due to a historical intolerance process. Like almost the totality of the American states, Brazil comes from a patriarchal and macho culture rooted in conservative values. And allied with these concepts, we must consider the religious process. The predominant religions, Catholicism and Neo-Pentecostalism, are contrary to gender diversity and have become powerful instruments in mass manipulation. All of this orthodox positioning drives violence against minorities, and the transgender community has become one of the main targets. Social restrictions. The transgender people in Brazil, in addition to sharing the entire discriminatory process suffered by the community, also suffers mainly from physical appearance, mannerisms, and consequent marginalization due to their social condition. Many are expelled from home and forced to leave school at a young age. Without options, they find prostitution as a way of survival, limiting social inclusion in adult life. This portion of the population lives below statistics and with restricted access to fundamental human rights. Many of these community members survive without the right to public security, social assistance, and health care. They're victims of the neglect of public assistance policies. Employment opportunities are minimal. Only 6% of the transgender community is part of the formal economy. According to Dr. Deborah Rodriguez, chief of police in charge of the police station responsible for crimes of racial and gender intolerance in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, she states that, open quote, the situation worsens when the person is Black and adept of African origin religions. Thus, the victims suffer triple discrimination. Close quotes. Prejudice within the community. The process of discrimination against the segment of the LGBTQIA+ community is so ingrained that gays with a classic beauty, considered normal by society, do not tolerate being associated with transgender people. The reality prevails, creating a subminority of the minority. Anyways, taking advantage of the images that we have here, I think it's important to point out that the community in Brazil widely accepts terms considered pejorative and outdated by Northern countries. Therefore, we must be careful when buying fundamental concepts. There is a heterogeneity of rules among other nations. In Brazil, for example, transvestites, transsexual, and transgender people have different approaches, and within the segment, the three variations are accepted and respected. Therefore, I'll give you the meanings. Transvestite, those are people born as male and who experience female gender roles, but do not claim a woman's identity. Transsexual. This term is used to designate people who have transitioned gender at some level, whether permanently or not. And transgender, those are people who don't identify with the gender assigned at birth and share roles of the opposite gender, claiming their social recognition as transgender women or men. Gender ideology, conservative argument of the extreme right in Brazil. Conservatives have used the so-called term gender ideology to encourage creating civic organizations that reinforce morality and religious beliefs. Conservative gender role discourse urged the assumption that gender equality and freedom would create permissiveness, moral disorder, and social decay. President Jair Bolsonaro's speech emphasized the defense of the family, reinforcing heteronormative concepts and strongly criticizing any sexual and gender diversity. Therefore, a moral crusade was imposed on the Brazilian population, affecting freedom of expression and reinforcing prejudice against the LGBTQIA communities. Fortunately, after this previous election in October, Brazil will have a new executive leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, democratically elected for the third time and with a history of respect for diversity and human rights policies. And finalizing, this election was marked by the victory of two trans women to the Federal Congress and a record of number of candidacies from transgender people across the country. There is some hope. Psychological and pathological effects of transphobic violence. Due to the inefficiency of the Brazilian health system, community members feel helpless. There is a lack of financial, emotional, and legal support, subjecting this portion of the population to psychological and pathological problems. In addition to being vulnerable, even today, the transgender population is still associated with the transmission of STDs, which indirectly encourages an increase in violence towards this population. Throughout my research for this essay, I went through many cases of violence against transgender people, but Dandara dos Santos' case called my attention for the level of brutality and sickness that the Brazilian society is experiencing right now. This woman was taken from her house where she lived with her mom at the daytime. She was dragged on the streets in a regular community with people passing by. She was dragged through the streets. She was beaten. She was hit with wood planks. She was humiliated in front of everyone with no help. One of the perpetrators shot a video through his cell phone, enjoying to see the suffering of a human being. These people tossed her in a wood barrel, took her to a silent alley, and shot her in the head 3 times. It's the sense of helpless that these people are probably feeling now in Brazil. It's really hard to describe. I have on the next slide the web address where you can find a small version of the live video, but I would like to warn you that the video contains really upsetting and graphic content. YouTube took it down, every single version of the video, due to the violent content, But I managed to find through this England newspapers a small version of the video, more than enough to give you people an idea of the level of violence that the transgender community is suffering in Brazil. Here you have the web address. Conclusion. Brazil has been the leader in murders against the transgender population for 13 consecutive years. Approximately 90% live at risk and have precarious access to public assistance. The life expectancy for these people is 35 years. Safety, healthy, and appreciation of human rights are fundamental, but still, as long as the world denies its population access to knowledge, to genuine education, human beings will continue to be victims of their ignorance. Paulo Freire, who was so critical of the banking concept of education that manipulates and conditions human beings to follow pre-established values, seems to me as a perfect example to be mentioned at the end of this presentation. Therefore, open quotes, changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. For the more the oppressed can be led to adapt to that situation, the easier to be dominated. Close quotes. Thanks for your attention, for sparing some time to watch my presentation, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.